everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another video where I review your DNA and genealogy questions. As always, if you would like me to answer your questions about DNA testing or genealogy, be sure to go to my subreddit r/GenieVlogger and post your questions there. But the subreddit isn't just for questions. Also post memes or anything related to genealogy that you think the community might enjoy. But let's jump into it. Not my grandfather? Hello all, I created a Reddit account just for this. My father got a DNA test for my siblings and I, no problems there, but it is a bit peculiar. He received 48% Scandinavian on his Ancestry test, my heritage for context, which is translated over to 31% Northwest European for me. All the rest is UK, which implies that one of his parents is from Scandinavia or so. However, he is traced back several generations in his family and all of them have English birth, death, census certificates, none at all outside of England. His grandmother's parents are missing, but both of their surnames are English, which didn't guarantee anything for sure, but this is a really significant percentage. 48% is what you would inherit from a parent, not a grandparent. Am I right in thinking that this implies that his father is not his father? I did see people mentioning that Scandinavia can be awkward when interacting with the UK. Now this one is an interesting one when thinking about this because we are looking at such a high amount of Scandinavian. And the poster mentions that they got 31% Northwest European, I'm guessing a general reading. So my question there is, did you all take my heritage or did your dad take my heritage and you took something else? Because that could really explain the discrepancy between you and your father. But just basing off of the admixtures, you can't really jump to a conclusion saying that your father's father must have been someone else. But it could certainly be indicative of that. Although Scandinavian is an extremely common population group for people of UK heritage to get, and even more, anyone with Northwestern European heritage to get. So if you really want to figure out, is your father's father truly his father, you would need to see, are there any cousins that you know through your father's side who have also done DNA testing, and if so, are they matching you and your father at what you would expect? Now the best case scenario would be if you can get your grandfather to test, or if your father has any siblings, have them test, because if your grandfather tests, that'll tell you right off the bat. If your father has any siblings and they test, you'd expect them to be full siblings, and if they're not full siblings, then obviously something's going on. Now that may not be possible for you depending on if your father even has siblings or if his father is alive or even willing to DNA test, but you can go further than that. Maybe your great-grandfather on that side had some siblings who have descendants that are alive, and maybe you can get them to test. So if you've done your genealogy, which it seems you have because you've traced the family back several generations, well, how much have you done in tracing it forward? And if you've done a decent amount tracing forward and you've identified living relatives, get in touch with them and see, have any of them DNA test, or just look through your matches and see if you can identify anyone that comes from that same family. Being that your father's tested at MyHeritage, when you look through his genetic matches, you should hopefully be able to look at the theory of relativity, which is basically a tool that MyHeritage has where they look at the family tree that you've built, assuming you've connected the DNA test to a profile in the family tree. Then it'll look at the family trees of your matches, and then it'll try to determine if there's some possible connection between the trees. So if you go on there and you start finding a bunch of cousins that are coming from branches of that side of your family tree, then you know that it's got to be true because you're finding the actual matches. But if you go through your matches and you're not finding any, that's when you're going to want to get in touch with a known cousin through your father's side to see if they'd be willing to DNA test. If they do it and they don't match your father, then you know that there's something going on, very possibly that your father's father is somebody else. But as I said, it is very possible that, you know, your family tree is what you thought it is. Your father's father is the person you think it is. It's just the nuances of these DNA tests and the difficulties with them. It's just making it so that for whatever reason, your father looks like he has 48% Scandinavian to MyHeritage's algorithm. Let's go to the next one. Hello, my known ancestry is African, Iberian, and Native American, but on MyHeritage, the results are showing some different stuff. I have part of my tree going to 1800. Till now, I haven't found any British, English, Scottish, Irish, or Welsh, or Italian. I found some Diakinos, but not sure if they really have Italian ancestry. Need to go back in time to find out how that happened. Could it be because of the North Portugal and Roman invasions on the Iberian Peninsula? My family's name Viana comes from the north of Portugal. My Y haplogroup is R1b-DF13 and mtDNA's X2F1. Also, the Inuit stuff, I guess it was from Native American side. Is that correct? Probably just like the Malay DNA, I guess. On the African side, this Kenyan and Maasai percentage is also unexpected. My great-grandfather is the most African ancestor I've known, but due to the Brazilian slavery, I don't know where his ancestors come from. The other members of the family also have African ancestry, but they are already very mixed, as most Brazilians. No idea how I can have Papuan DNA due to the percentage. It is maybe an error. Could it be the calculators misunderstanding some African DNA as Papuan? The additional genetic groups are pretty accurate. My family is most from Rio Grande do Norte and Sierra. All right, so looking at the results for African, Nigerian 20.2, Sierra Leonean 8.3, Kenyan 8, North African 2.1, Maasai 1.9, America, Mesoamerican and Andean 19.3, European, Italian 11.5%, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh 9%, Iberian 6.1%, English 4.1%, Greek and South Italian 3.9%, Scandinavian 2%, and then for Asian, Filipino, Indonesian, and Malay 1.4%, Inuit 1.3%, and then Oceania, Papuan 0.9%. And then we have the additional genetic groups, which they said are correct. So starting out, the first question you had was about your European, in that you hadn't found any British, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, or Italian, and so you were wondering what's going on with that. You do indicate known Iberian ancestry, which obviously makes sense for someone from Brazil, so there could be a few things going on here. First off, you do mention that you've only got part of your tree going back to the 1800s. So that means that I'm guessing part of your tree doesn't go back that far. So there's going to be a big portion of it that's a big question mark. So it's very possible that this is just coming from these parts of your family tree that you just haven't really built out that well yet. Another part of that possibility is some of what you've built out might be a little bit off, or you might not have the full information, and maybe there are some European ancestors hiding in there that you're assuming are maybe something else. When we scroll down and look at your European, let's add it up and we can figure out, well, about how far back can it be, assuming that maybe it's coming from one ancestor. So added up total, you have 36.6% European, and that is a big chunk, although the Iberian you did know about. It's really that English, Irish, Scottish, well, the Italian and the other stuff that seems to be the big question mark. Now, usually I would add up the European, and that would kind of give us an idea of about how far back is that European coming from, obviously assuming that it's just coming from one ancestor. But with this, especially being that the person's Brazilian, I think it can be pretty confident that it's going to be from at least a few European ancestors, some very quite distantly, because many Brazilians have a lot of Iberian ancestry, which is going to trace back to the first Iberians arriving in the Americas. And some of the non-Iberian European DNA that you're getting might actually be readings from your Iberian DNA that's just being misread as something else, most especially when you're looking at Italian and then the Greek and South Italian, because there is a lot of connection just because they're all connected through those waterways. And just to kind of reiterate back to that whole thing of only part of the tree is traced back to the 1800s, well, for a lot of these tests, it's usually thought of looking at basically like the past 300 years. So even for those lines traced to the 1800s, you still are going to have some of those lines which maybe there's an English or Scottish ancestor hiding back one more generation, and you're getting, 2% from there or something like that. Because if you're about my age, someone living in the early 1800s, or at least let's say someone born in the early 1800s, that's probably going to be about a fourth great grandparent. Could be as close as a third, might be as distant as a fifth, but about that distance. And so around that distance, that's where you're looking at the 3%, 2%, 1%. So basically really complicated to really say anything specific. It's going to take more testing and all of that. And you can also look at your genetic matches and see if you're getting anything close of people that are fully Italian or fully Scottish or fully English or something like that. And then lastly, you mentioned that the Kenyan and Maasai percentage was unexpected, but you also seem to indicate that you really didn't know that much about your great-grandfather, but even more, you'd mentioned before, you only have some of your tree traced out to the 1800s, so I imagine there's a lot of your tree that's just unknown, and so it would make a lot of sense that there's going to be some African ancestry that you might just not know about. But on top of that, similar to the European, there's also that complication of how well are they reading this, and they don't have as good of population references for Africa, so they might actually be having a bigger difficulty deciphering that. So in a sense, all the answers are kind of the same. Might just be difficulties in reading it. Probably has to do partly with the fact that you don't have as much of your tree traced out. You only have part of it traced to the 1800s. And then, some of it might actually be true and there might be something hiding in there, or it might just be the misread. On to the next one. How many DNA matches? How many DNA matches, for example, on Ancestry are a normal amount? What does it depend on how many matches one gets? For sure, it depends on how many people have tested in my country. How many DNA matches has an average DNA tester from the US, from other countries, and from different ethnicities? How many DNA matches are suspicious for endogamy? I just wonder if that may be interesting questions as well for other genealogy nerds. Myself, I am from Germany with many immigrants to the US in the 19th century in my family tree. 6,500 DNA matches, mainly distant family, most of them in the United States. Now, the difficulty of answering this question really comes down to the part of normal amount. And I can't really say that there's probably a normal amount. Just like you say, I think it's really going to depend on not necessarily country, but more of population group that people are coming from. So right off the bat, the biggest thing is if you are from a European ancestry, you're probably going to have a lot of matches. This mostly has to do with the fact that the people that have taken DNA tests most have been people with European ancestry. And so more people with European ancestry testing means that if you're European, you're probably going to get more matches. In my experience, I have noticed that people that come from endogamous populations almost always will get thousands upon thousands of matches, unless, of course, you're on one of the sites like 23andMe, which only limits your matches to 1,500 people. But similarly, when I trace the family trees for Mr. Beat and for Matt Baker, both of them had tons of matches, thousands upon thousands. Both Mr. Beat and Matt Baker were coming from largely European backgrounds, both having a very strong German-French connection. Interestingly enough, both of them having a connection to the Alsace-Lorraine area of France. In my experience with people with African ancestry, they will often have a good amount of matches, not quite as many as people that are European, but there seems to be a pretty good amount of people from the South who have African American ancestry who've tested. But then in my experiences of working with DNA tests that have Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latin ancestry, there do seem to be a lot fewer of matches. But I think a big part of that probably has to do with the fact that more people in the US are going to be testing than people that are in Latin America and in the Caribbean. But even more, there are tests in those areas just for people in those areas. So one of the big ones that I know that's based out of Brazil, I'm pretty sure, is Genealogist. But because there are tests outside of the US that a lot of people will take, if you do test at a US company, but let's say you're from Brazil, well, it's probably a good idea to upload to GEDmatch because there's probably going to be a lot of people who've uploaded to GEDmatch from these other tests like Genealogist. And I could probably keep going through all sorts of different groups just because there are so many. I figured, European and African, probably two of the biggest ones. But it really will be based on your population group and where you're coming from. And if, let's say, you're a recent immigrant from East Asia to the United States and you take a DNA test, so let's say like you're a Korean adoptee, you may not get that many DNA matches because you're so recently connected to Asia that most of your close relatives still live there. And if they're not really going to be testing with the company that you've tested with, you have a much smaller chance of then matching significant matches. But this is definitely an interesting topic, and I would really love to see some sort of study or something that looked into this because I think it is a major question for a lot of people. And it could actually be really helpful to point people in a direction for a specific test, Similar to how for my heritage, I'll often push people towards that if they have Eastern European ancestry, because a lot of people in Eastern Europe will do my heritage test, and a lot of people across Europe in general will do my heritage tests as opposed to an ancestry test or one of the other tests. On to the next one. Endogamy. I've seen your videos on Jewish endogamy and how it affects relatedness between Jewish people. My problem is that I come from a small island population in the Mediterranean Sea, and every DNA company lists my genetic relatives as being much closer to me than they are judging from their trees. And my tree where the trees are available to me. My parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents were not first or second cousins. In most cases where I can check the relatedness is at the distant level. Is there an easy way of eliminating these distant cousins shown as being much closer? Now, this is a question that I imagine a lot of people get, because when it comes to endogamy, it's actually much more complicated than a lot of people think. Now, unfortunately, endogamy is not the same across different population groups, and that's the biggest part of where the complications lie. So whenever you see things like what I put out about how to overcome Jewish endogamy, that's really something that's mostly focused on Jewish endogamy, and it can be applied to other endogamous groups, but it won't be able to apply to all of them. Island population groups are honestly some of the worst when it comes to endogamy. And if you come from a family where on both sides, your mom and your dad's side, they're both coming from the same island population and it traces back really far, you're going to be dealing with some of the worst endogamy. And I should say, for anyone who doesn't know what endogamy is just when a population group only marries within its own population group. Usually it's for either geographic reasons, sometimes ethnic reasons, religious reasons, cultural reasons, whatever. But for generations, only certain people within a certain group will marry each other. And for island populations, this is often compounded just because of the fact that you're on an island, there's not as much area, there's not going to be as many people, it's going to be a lot harder to interact with others because taking a boat to travel somewhere is a lot harder than walking or taking a horse or something like that. So the travel is going to be much less, and there's going to be a lot fewer people going in and out of that community. And what a lot of people often do as well is they conflate the idea of endogamy to being incest. Basically, oh, okay, well, endogamy must mean that they descend from a lot of second cousin marriages and first cousin marriages and third cousin marriages and whatnot. But as this person indicates, they couldn't find any in recent times up to their great-great-great-grandparents. So what's going on? Well, the truth about endogamy is it's not really as much about the incestuous relationships like first cousin marriages and second cousin marriages and all of that. It's much more about the fact that people are going to be related in multiple ways. So the purest form of this is what is known as double cousins. So basically imagine there's a pair of sisters. They meet a pair of brothers. One sister marries one of the brothers. The other sister marries the other brother. Their children will be first cousins to each other in two ways. So while their actual relationship is just first cousin, it's first cousin through their mom and it's first cousin through their dad. So they're first cousin two times, which means they're going to share twice the amount of DNA that first cousins would actually share, and thus look more like half siblings. So when you're dealing with endogamy, you're dealing with that happening tons of times very, very distantly. So if you have a person that, let's say, is an eighth cousin at their closest to you, but they're related to you in at least 6 ways. Well, if you are an eighth cousin, let's say maybe you share about 10 centimorgans. Well, you share 10 centimorgans in 6 different ways. All of a sudden, that's adding up to 60 centimorgans. So what this causes is it causes your DNA matches to look a lot closer than they truly are. So there are some tricks that have been developed to overcome this for some of these endogamous population groups. The one that I know the best is people with Jewish endogamy, where the focus is usually on the segments. The reason being because people that have Jewish ancestry deal with endogamy, but that endogamy is often a little bit further in the past. We're talking 400, 500 years back. So most people that are dealing with Jewish endogamy, while there is going to be an increase in how much DNA they share with each other, it's a little bit manageable. And by manageable, we can figure it out by looking at the DNA segments. So if someone is related at 60 centimorgans, that would be about a third cousin or so. So for Jewish endogamy, the big trick is to focus on segments. because by focusing on segments, you can get an idea of if someone is closer related to you or just further related to you in multiple ways. Because if they're further related to you in multiple ways, they'll end up sharing more segments because there's all these different little segments and then they add up to being this larger total amount, as opposed to someone who would be a true, let's say, third cousin with 60 centimorgans, where instead it's going to be just big chunks. But unfortunately, this isn't something that can be applied to all endogamous groups. I know I've tried to use it on different population groups that I've seen DNA tests. So I had one person that did a DNA test. They came from a Pacific Islander population, and they literally had pages upon pages of matches that were like 300 and 400 centimorgan matches, and obviously were not anywhere close to being that related to that person. So hopefully in time, more tricks will come out for different population groups that deal with endogamy on ways that they'll be able to overcome their issues of endogamy. And if you come from an endogamous population group and you'd like to learn more about what I've found in overcoming Jewish endogamy, be sure to check out this tutorial I did right here. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. That really does help me out. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It is completely free to do so. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Genealogist. I'm the Genie Vlogger. See you in my next video.